Welcome back. New objectivity. So this is a reaction against the German Expressionism in Germany during the 1920s. Okay, remember that in the German Expressionism, we had the Die Bruck and Der Blau Reiter, and as I had mentioned before, we will get into the particulars, but we had an artist who had a lot of mental health issues, and his art had been banned as degenerate by Adolf Hitler. He committed suicide then. We had Wasily or Vasily, depending on the country you're at, Kandinsky, who had said that he wanted to convey in his art a musicality to his art form. Okay, so this is, now we're looking at a reaction against this, and this is considered post-expressionism, of artists who originally had art during the late expressionist movement. So it's to focus on an objective view of life. Okay, so you have the word subjective and objective. Let's say you're on a jury and there's a trial. You're supposed to be objective. Subjective is if I ask you, which period do you like more? Do you like ancient Greek and Roman? Do you like medieval? Do you like impressionist, post-impressionist, realism, new objectivity, etc.? So that would be subjective. Okay, there's a focus again on an objective view of life, a more tangible reality. So what is tangible? Something tangible is this. This is a very formidable piece of furniture. It's a little, some might use it as a nightstand, a little table that has drawers. I used it to put in items for art history, to do works of art that we could create from our inventory of pieces that we study. So that's what something tangible is, something that you can touch and feel. Subjects of work focus more on the commonplace and straightforward. So if you're taking something commonplace and straightforward, it would be a genre scene, like this scene that we're looking at right here and right now, rather than Napoleon fighting in a battle, or George Washington crossing the Delaware River. Okay, Cubism. So this is an extension of the formal ideas developed by Cézanne, who was the post-impressionistic painter and father of Cubism. It reveals more than the eye can see, because what they've done is they've broken this piece and they've sort of put it together, fusing multiple perspectives and moments in time. Draws attention to the flatness of the canvas itself. Remember that several artists, including Monet, had wanted, and Manet had wanted to make sure that you knew, hey, this is a flat canvas. So here we have Picasso's Le Demoiselle d'Avignon. We see the influence of the African mask, the fang mask here. We see a lot of jagged angles, and we see the broken nature and the geometry of his work. And here's Le Demoiselle d'Avignon by Pablo Picasso at the MoMA in New York City. Now let's jump into Dada. So Dada is a nonsense word, and it literally means a hobby horse. So after World War I, the people in the world had experienced so much horror. There had been so much death, so much destruction all over the world, that they wanted a rejection of everything that they had known up to that point. So what did they do? They wanted to reject conventional methods of representation. What does that mean? Okay, so let's say that I'm an artist and I want to draw this cup of water. I would put it in front of me, and I'm not an artist, I'm an art historian, so I wouldn't even know how to begin to do this. So, in the same way as some artists know only enough of art history that they study that because they need to, but they were given that talent. They were born with that talent at birth. So they are trying to look at this and paint it very accurately, whereas the Dada is said, we're just not going to paint things the way that we see them. We're going to reject that. No more oil on canvas, that's old time. And so this Dadaist took a urinal, turned it upside down, and called it the fountain. So the Dadaists would take an object that was a random object, in this case, as you see, it's a urinal. And so this ready-made was anything that he could think of. He said, well, anything can be art if I say that it's art and I'm the artist. So the concept is just in the execution. It was very short-lived, 1914 to 1918, which are the dates of World War I. And it caused so many questions to be asked. Namely, what is art? Okay. Throughout the world, you're going to find many iterations of this particular work, The Fountain, by Marcel Duchamp. This particular one is in Philadelphia, where they have quite a few of his oeuvre. Now, on to the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so you will recall that in the United States, there was a period of time when the European people went to Africa and took to the States, to the islands in the Caribbean, to South America and other places, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on the black people that came as Africans to the U.S., and then they came as slaves. They were not freed until President Abraham Lincoln freed them with the Emancipation Proclamation. However, that did not mean that discrimination had ended in the United States by any means. And it was not until the 1965 Civil Rights Act that more and more rights were given to the black people, because up until that time, the black people had their own toilets, their own water fountains, their own restaurants, their own neighborhoods, their own schools. Everything that was called segregation. So that is the backdrop to this area that we're going to be talking about now in the story of art, called the Harlem Renaissance. So it was roughly from 1920 to 1930, an African American that became an African American neighborhood, Harlem, and this is in New York City. So with this migration came an influx of talent. What that means is, as black people moved to this area, they brought their talents, their artistic talents, their musical talents, their creative talents. So what were they in? Painting, theater, music, writing, photography, like any group of people. And what are the themes in this Harlem Renaissance? Racial pride, civil rights, influence of slavery on modern culture. Now, just so you know, notice the dates here. This is from 1920 to 1930. When did I say the Civil Rights Act was enacted? The 1965 by Martin. It started, the movement started with Martin Luther King Jr. So at this point, you still had segregation and there was still a lot of racism. What is the United States trying to do now to remedy this problem? Well, they have what they call diversity, equity, and inclusion, meaning that in every job place and particularly in museum, they want to hire people that are black, because traditionally these were professions where black people were not hired at all. And now the majority of the workers in museums that are the guards that guard the art, and curators of museums are, for the most part, the workers that deal with all the inventory are black, and now more and more we're starting to see curators that are also black. So, Jacob Lawrence, this happens to be the most significant of the black artists during this time period, and he chronicled the exodus of the southern black from living in the south to going up north. And these are two images from the MoMA. Now, half of the images in this series are at the MoMA, and the other half is in a museum in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital in the United States. And the particular one that's part of the AP Art History happened to be when I went there to get my visa for China. It was out of the country, so I didn't get to see that one, but I've seen half of his collection, the one at the MoMA. It's not always on display. Okay, here's another one, and this is called The Library. Now, the piece that's part of the AP Art History is this one, and you can see how he had a banister where the white people were on one side, the black people were on the other, and you see the body language of the black people. They're kind of bent down, and that's usually to show if you're stooped over like this, you feel downtrodden, whereas this man is smoking a cigar. He looks very arrogant, and this one looks like reading the paper or reading the book, and he can't be bothered. So they're portraying that egotistical white male dominance, as they call it now, but we have to be careful when we label movements or things, because not every white person is racist, not every black person is a victim, and not every black person is not a racist. So racism just means that you believe that your race or your culture is superior to anyone else's. And I am of the opinion that we all bring something to the table. Every decent human being wants to contribute something to society. So, jumping right into surrealism. And we see here a painting by Frida Kahlo on the top right, and at the bottom one by Salvador Dali. So what is surrealism? So it's an interest in anarchy and revolution. And there was a lot of anarchy and revolution taking place at this time, particularly in Mexico. So they're looking for a source of social liberation. They were influenced by Sigmund Freud, and he wanted to explore the subconscious thought or dreams and identity. He wanted to bypass restrictions placed on them by society. So, society at the time was ruled by Judeo-Christian ethics and norms. And Sigmund Freud said, no, this is not the way it needs to be, this is not the way it should be. The way that it is really, and the way that it should be really, is that we are all born as sexual beings, and any kind of problem that we're currently experiencing emotionally has to do with something that went awry during our upbringing or in our adulthood that has to do with sex. And he had different time periods of whether you were nursed or not as a baby, whether or not you felt secure, and he attributed everything to some type of anomaly in your sexuality. Okay, so what were the practices? Waking dreams, seances, automatism, exquisite corpse, disrupting norms, or an internal reality merging with an external reality. So all these were themes that Sigmund Freud looked at. So here we have the painting The Two Fridas by Frida Kahlo, and we see the storm in the background, right? And this is supposed to be a portrait of both of them. Here we have the Frida, that's the European Frida, with European attire, and here we have the Mexican Frida with her Mexican attire. Now, Frida had a German or European dad, and her mom was indigenous from Mexico, so she was half European, half Mexican. She met and fell in love with a fellow artist, Diego Rivera, who was also very renowned, and they had a very tumultuous marriage and relationship. They were married and divorced, then remarried. She had a terrible accident where she couldn't have children, and they were both, in fact, subscribed to the political philosophy of communism, and so they participated in revolts in Mexico. So her atheism, her communist beliefs always influenced her artwork, and it was a type of nihilism as well. And so here we see that her heart is broken, and this Frida is holding a little image of Diego Rivera, and she's cauterizing a vein that's spewing blood. Why? Because she's torn between her love and her hate of her husband, her love and her hate of having to be bicultural, and just the internal drama and dilemma that Frida had to live through. The bottom work is The Passage of Time by Salvador Dali, and we see these clocks that are sort of melting over, and it's to infer that time is fluid and time is always passing. So this is in Mexico City, and it's at the Museum of Modern Art in Mexico City, the city proper. So she said, I have been called surrealist, but I don't feel like that's what I am. So you see, again, what I had just talked about, the juxtaposition to her two self-portraits, Frida as a Spanish lady and Frida as a European. Spanish as in Hispanic from Mexico. And then The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, that we also discussed. Now moving on to constructivism. Okay, so this is an experimentation with new architectural materials. Assembled them without any historical references. So what's happening? You have New Russia, an idealistic center, no historical reference or decoration, and everything is new. Dramatic use of materials used to create projects. So what the constructivists, that's what I mean by they, what the constructivists were trying to accomplish was to put out their political feelings and portray what was happening politically, socially in their country. So in the background here, we see a picture of Russia and their programs at the time. So one of the artists was Alexander Rodchenko with Dobrolei, and this is at the MoMA in New York. So we're dealing with new architectural materials. Buildings were designed, but they didn't have a facade that was very particular, or a facade that had to do with an architectural reference from before, but rather just a facade, period, and as plain as possible. And we can see that to a certain extent in the buildings. A lot of the apartment buildings in China follow this formula. And so this is an Alexander Rodchenko poster for a Russian state airline. Okay. de stijl. Okay, and so this is symbolized by a Dutch painter by the name of Piet Mondrian. And he did not start off by painting just complete boxes with color. He started by painting the way most artists begin, that they might start with more realistic and naturalistic or veristic paintings, and then they become more and more surreal, or more and more impressionist, or more and more abstract, or words that are generally used. So in this case, we have gone from an artist who painted a number of different ways and styles to he was called to just paint a completely abstract work. Tiles that make no reference to nature whatsoever, or anything else for that matter. The lines all had to be perpendicular and no diagonal. So here you see one of his works, which happens to be the AP work, which is red, blue, and yellow. And he thought that everything that he wanted to express in art could be expressed just by boxes with color. So this is this precise piece, which is the composition I just mentioned, red, blue, and yellow, by Piet Mondrian. So this is in 1930. And this particular work is at the Kunsthaus Museum in Zurich. And again, to put it in context as to what's happening in the world at this time, 1930 is, we've already passed World War I. We're not yet at World War II, and 1929 to 1935 is when we had the Second World War, and we had just come out of a depression in the US. So now Mexican muralism. This is a major revival of Mexican art. Artists trained in the tradition of fresco painting promoted a political or social message, and the major themes were the labor and struggle of the working classes and socialism. Now, this painting is by Diego Rivera, and if and when you visit Mexico City, you will see that the entire city is replete with the works of the Mexican muralists. There are frescoes inside the churches, there are frescoes in all the government buildings, and there are museums that feature all of these frescoes. So in this work, you have Diego showing a history of Mexico from the perspective of the working class, and how he believed he wanted to express the fact that from his perspective, the Mexicans had been abused. The Mexican people had been abused by the leaders who had an abuse of power. They did not use it to help the people, but rather to enrich themselves. And so here we have La Catrina, or La Calavera as she's called. Here's a young Diego Rivera. Here's his wife, Frida, and he portrays himself here as a young boy. And here you have Frida Kahlo, but she's already a mature woman, and she's holding a yin-yang, because a yin-yang is supposed to, you know better than I do, this being an Asian concept, like the balance of the yin and the yang. And he felt that their relationship was a yin and yang, that they were like polar opposites. And then here we see various dictators, various laborers. You see here some of the people that were responsible for colonizing Mexico. One of the very important people in their culture, right in here, is Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And when we get to Mexican muralism, we'll take a closer look at this. But basically, it's a portrayal with very famous, every single solitary person in this painting, with very few exceptions, is a major person in either the history of Mexico or somehow related to the history of Mexico. And so this is my husband and I in Mexico City. This museum has only this work. It has, let me change that a bit. The museum is dedicated to this, and then they have a very small loft that has a very tiny exhibition from photographs from this time period. So we spend hours here because it's such a compelling piece, and a piece that deserves so much attention and time. And I would love for you to see the book that explains each and every character. But when we get to that, to this work, I will have that book with me, and I will get into more of a deep dive into this work by Diego Rivera. Okay, let's jump now to architecture, 20th century architecture. So what are we going to expect in architecture of the 20th century? Well, obviously, if we've had technological advances, we're going to see that everywhere. And one of the first places we're going to see it is in architecture. So ferro concrete. Ferro is iron. And so it's ferro concrete construction. You have the skeleton framework and then the glass walls. And then you also have the concept of the cantilever, which is a projecting beam attached to a building at one end but suspended into the air at the other. So we're going to see a building by Frank Lloyd Wright called Falling Water, and you have the building itself, and then a cantilever extends out like this from the building. It could be a balcony, it could be a ceiling, but it's still attached to the building, and you have a very large extended area out in the front. So this 20th century architecture, this one in particular with the cantilevers, you rarely see columns or flying buttresses. Now, because our studies began with global, modern, and contemporary, we did not look at the Greco-Roman columns. We did not look at a building like Notre Dame that had a flying buttress, which is a structure that looks like this. It's angled, and it is a supporting mechanism of a building. So they did not have this now. So there were two different styles now. What is known as the prairie style and the international style. We're going to see examples of each. So this is the building that I had mentioned to you before with the cantilevering. So this is the prairie style, and it rejected historic styles of architecture. The building should be in harmony with the site. So when Frank Lloyd Wright was asked about designing by the family, the Kaufman family that owned this property, they lived in the city and they wanted a property out in the country. They said, we want a place to go out and chill and relax and look at the waterfall. And Frank Lloyd Wright was a genius, and he took a lot of license in what he did and didn't do. And so he went off on a vacation, and then he comes back, and he 45 minutes before he was meeting with Mr. Kaufman, he did a sketch. And Mr. Kaufman is like, what? And he goes, yes, no, you asked me for a house looking at the waterfall, and I designed a house where you're living in the waterfall. So as you can see here, you have the structure using materials from that area, incorporating it into the waterfall, and then you have your cantilevers. But it just seems to blend in to the environment. So the building should be in harmony with the site and nature. You have complex irregular plans made up of abstract shapes, which we're looking at here. So you see rectangles, triangles, squares, and circles. They used organic materials, meaning not man-made materials, but things that they could use that was a little bit more primitive, such as pebbles, which are little rocks, stucco, which is a plaster used to refine the walls a little bit. Rough hewn lumber means that they used wood, but they didn't try to perfect it. They wanted to leave it with that rough look, and also natural woods. The emphasis was on the horizontal. Remember when with the architecture that we studied earlier on, which was the skeletal architecture, it was all vertical. This emphasis is on the horizontal. Horizontal, 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 and obviously you need at least one vertical area. So the architect for this was Frank Lloyd Wright, and he is the iconic architect for the United States. So this is my husband and I at Falling Water in Bear Run, Pennsylvania. So we see the cantilevers, which is this structure here. Just here's the one vertical, but everything else is horizontal, and then everything is in harmony with nature. Okay, and then now to a totally different animal, as we like to say here. That's an expression which means a totally different thing. You have what is known as the international style, which is houses that were called a machine for living. And what this architect of the Bauhaus nature says, a house should be functional. Form follows function, and it should flow so that you can get what you need to do in your house done very efficiently and well. So it was influenced by streamlined qualities of Bauhaus. You had clean, spacious white lines, a skeleton structure with glass wrapping around the walls, lack of architectural ornamentation, no painting, no sculptures on exterior surfaces. It is just a plain building, as you can see right here. And this building was designed by Le Corbusier. It's right outside Paris, like on, not in the city proper, but a little bit on the outskirts. This was built in 1929 of steel and reinforced concrete, and you will always associate it with the line form follows function, meaning the form of the building is going to follow the function that that building is going to serve. Again, Villa Savoy. Okay, from architecture to abstract expressionism. What if I were to tell you that the artist in this picture was trying to convey an image of the glamorous Marilyn Monroe and Olivia de Havilland and all the beautiful women of that period, and he wanted to make a mockery of it. So this is Willem de Kooning's Woman, and it's sometimes called the New York School. It's the first American avant-garde art movement. And by way of review, we went over it in our previous review lesson. Avant-garde art, or avant-garde anything, is you're on the cutting edge of what's happening right now. This is it. This is where we're going. This is something brand new, and here you have it. Okay? So it's a reaction against artists like Mondrian. So you remember Pete Mondrian with the goldfish, Pete Mondrian, that also had rooms that were for artists, so artist studio. He also liked to have women sitting on couches, etc. So reaction against artists like Mondrian, there was a minimalist approach to abstraction. Okay, so in the abstract expressionists, they wanted a more active representation of the hand of the artist on a given work. So when you look at this, you're like, wow, look at those brush strokes, right? And we see that the artist wants you to see, hey, this is a painting and we have this brushwork and it is my hand that's putting it on the canvas. Okay, this was painted and repainted and repainted. There are 200 iterations of this painting on this canvas. He kept coming back to it and coming back to it and coming back to it and reframing it and restructuring and repainting it. Okay, so we have also action drip painting, which is an abstract painting in which the artist drips or splatters paint onto a canvas in order to create the work. So that's different from the William de Kooning, but it's similar. William de Kooning generally had works where you could see a woman. He really liked to have women in his work. So this is Woman 1 by de Kooning, and this is at the MoMA. And now we're going to look at color field, which is the abstract expressionism. Okay, and this relies on subtle tonal values that are variation of monochromatic hue. Now that's a wordful, but we'll break it down. So what this is saying is, in the case of this painting, this is a painting by Helen Frankenthaler, and what she did was she took a color, and which is a mono. Mono means one color, one chrome, one hue, and she took that and let the paint kind of go where it wanted to, so you have the same tonality but taking on more vibrant areas, more lighter areas, of course, areas where you have the paint that was really saturated, and some right in here where it looks like, oh, there's hardly any paint, right? So who are the notable artists that we know in this movement of color field? Helen Frankenthaler, which is this artist, and this particular painting is called The Bay, and Mark Rothko. So with Frankenthaler, images are mysteriously hovering in an ambiguous space. So you don't have like a foundational line or a line where you have the sunset and then you have your earth where the two converge, but you have this kind of like flying in the air somewhere, just hovering. Okay, and this was popular in the 1960s. So these are works by Helen Frankenthaler. Okay, and then now pop art. Pop art gained momentum in the 50s, climaxed in the 60s. So from the 50s to the 60s is when we saw pop art. The pop artists used materials of the everyday world, kind of like the Dadaists did. So items of mass popular culture, consumer goods, or famous singers, or in the case of this is Marilyn Monroe. No distinction between high art or design of mass-produced items. So before there was a lot of emphasis on, oh, I own this original. But in the case of pop art, you could have multiple copies of one work. It was all about the commonplace, bringing viewers face to face with the reality of that work. And it was a reaction against abstract expressionists. So we see that as we cover one period to the other, it is generally a reaction to the preceding period. Okay, so post-World War II, we saw enormous growth in American economy. Consumerism, spend more money. Okay, so this is the Marilyn Diptych by Andy Warhol, who lived in London, UK. And this work is at the Tate Modern, and it's acrylic on canvas. Now, acrylic is a medium of paint that looks like oil in some ways, but is very different from oil in how you use it, how long it takes to dry, etc. And at one point in art history, artists began to work with acrylics as opposed to oil. Now, do some artists still use oil as a medium? Yes. Do the majority of artists that are working on a canvas use acrylic? The majority does. So you have both, but the majority would use acrylics. Okay, and then happenings. This word happenings was coined in the late 50s. When an expression is coined, what that means is that this expression came up and became known as X, Y, or Z, i.e., in this case, happening. And it's to describe an act or performance art that is initially planned but involves spontaneity, improvisation, and sometimes audience participation. The examples today are flash mobs, improv theater, and performance art. So in this case, we see here Yayoi Kusama, and she had these balls that were to mirror your image, and she said that this was your narcissism for sale, so that you could look at yourself and say, oh, look how beautiful I look, and to portray the concept of narcissism. So this is Narcissus Garden, which was an installation that they put together in New York City at their botanical gardens, and it's to reference the myth of Narcissus and Echo from the Greek myths, and it's a satire of selfie obsession. So especially now, more than ever before in our lives, we're seeing how people are very involved with themselves, and you'll go to a museum and the last thing people are doing is looking at the work of art in many cases. And I can tell you, because I travel a lot and this is my vocation and my avocation, and sometimes it's hard to even get to see a work because people are wanting to take a selfie with it. Now, is there something wrong with it? No. It's to the extent that it is being done and how it inhibits people that want to go and spend serious quality time with a work. It detracts from it if you have a line of people waiting to take selfies, and it's not just one, it's many. So sometimes there's nothing wrong with a particular behavior. It's to the extent that you carry that behavior to that may become a problem, either for you or for society or both. Okay, now earth art or site art. This is dependent on a location to render a work's full meaning, using the environment. Many are temporary, like in this case, the Spiral Jetty. And the Spiral Jetty is at Salt Lake City, Utah. Okay, then postmodern architecture. This emerged in the late 70s and 80s, and it was a reaction against the international style, because in the international style, you'll recall that you had a very staid exterior. It was just the walls and the very straight columns. That was it. Form follows functions. Now, this is a reaction, and they said, oh, that was too cold, and we don't need to be so form follows function. Let's add some ornamentation. Let's bring in some architectural expression. Let's reference things from the past, but give it a little bit of a modern twist. So this was the concept developed by Venturi, Roche, Brown, and this is in the state of Delaware. So this is known as a craftsman design, and it's wood frame and stucco. So you see here, rather than vertical versus horizontal or very plain, or having the cantilevers, you have something dramatically different. And so this concludes our review of the different movements and styles. that will encompass what we will be learning throughout the rest of the course. Thank you for your time and attention.